Hey Nick, how you doing this afternoon?
Doing great, Dave. How are you?
I'll tell you what, I am very glad it's Friday.
Absolutely, me too.
And Friday means another recording of the soon to be famous Kitchen Table Finance podcast.
That's right. Podcast day. Let's do
Yes.
this.
So this is kind of a continuation of a topic we started back in January with the new year. We did a kind of a deep dive in how to get started on budgeting. But this is kind of an advanced form of budgeting that applies to a lot of people, and we get a lot of questions around how do we make a budget when our income isn't even, when it's lumpy.
Right.
And,
Yeah. So unfortunately, not everybody gets paid the same amount every 2 weeks like clockwork. And more these days, it seems like we have uneven amounts of income, whether that's teachers getting paid for the months out of the year that
right.
they work, which is what we run into a lot with our MSU folks, but
Yep.
also people that are maybe self-employed and income fluctuates, or people that are employed, but maybe a big part of their salary is bonus structure, and that can
Right.
fluctuate from month to month.
Yeah. Yeah. So either way, things are lumpy. And yeah, the first time I sat down to figure this kind of problem out with clients, it was a couple of MSU professors who were being paid for a whole year's worth of salary, but being only paid during the school months. So they got all 12 months in the span of 9 months.
Right.
So to tackle that sort of problem, the easiest way to do it from my point of view is when you're constructing your budget, when you're sitting down and figuring out what your expenses are, make three columns instead of just two. And if you think back to when we talked about budgeting originally, we talked about taking all of your annual and semi-annual bills and figuring out what the monthly amount was, right?
Right.
Dividing them by 12. So you're budgeting a little bit for the insurance bill, a little bit for your taxes. Mortgage is easy because that is monthly, but essentially turn everything into a monthly expense.
Mm.
Well, in this situation, you have to think about it in terms of what is the annual expense divided by 9. So you figure out your whole year's worth of expense. If you're paying $1,000 a month for your mortgage, you need $12,000 a year. But in those 9 months that you're being paid in the teacher scenario, you need to budget $1,333 every month, so that then in June, July, and August, you've got that $3,000 you need set aside.
Right. Yeah. And so a couple things. One is, and I think where people get into trouble, just like anything, is having a budget in the first place. Understanding what those numbers are is probably
Right,
the most important part, right? How
right,
much is my
right.
mortgage every month? And then it gets even more complicated because if you have money coming in every month and going out every month, and it's even, it's easy to not necessarily exactly know what those
Yeah,
numbers are and what that is. But when you're on uneven income, everything's going to be great when you're getting money in on a monthly basis, but when it stops for those 3 months out of the year,
right.
in your scenario, Dave, it's going to be all of a sudden no crap.
Right, right, right. And sometimes I sound like a broken record with this stuff, I know, but this is where some of the electronic tools really shine. Like my favorite being You Need a Budget, but there's a lot of online systems out there that essentially replicate the old envelope system, where every time you get paid, you're sticking a little bit away for each expense, so you know what you got and what it's designated for. You can do that on paper, you can do it electronically, but some kind of accounting system, even if it's opening a separate savings account that you label as this is what I need for summer. And I
Right.
know a lot of like the MSU faculty uses the MSU credit union, and I believe they have that built right into their account structure where you can label
Right.
certain savings accounts for certain uses like
Absolutely.
that. Yeah.
Yeah, that's a great way to do it in the digital world of not having envelopes tucked under your
Right.
mattress like your
Right.
grandparents might have.
Right. Or
Um,
mason jars, that would work
yeah,
too.
right.
But yeah.
So,
Yeah.
but the other thing, the flip side of this too, that I'll say is it's not just if you have uneven income. A lot of times you'll have uneven expenses. And so, for
Right.
example, you might have a bill that comes in quarterly, and if you're not preparing for that by putting that money aside on a monthly basis, you kind of get into the same trap. Or
Yeah.
if you have an annual bill like your car tabs, I always harp harp on that one because that's my gift from the state of Michigan. Is my my birthday gift is my car tax every year, my bill. But you know, if you're paying property taxes, if it's not escrowed, or if you are in Michigan and your gas bill skyrockets for 4 months out of the year, you know, all of these things are things that if you have a budget and you break that annual expense down monthly, the same philosophy applies. It's just a little bit more exacerbated, if you will, if you're only getting paid 9 months out of the year.
Yeah. A good way to put it is budgeting is important, and if your income is uneven, it's even more important.
Right.
And the more uneven your income is, the more important budgeting is. So you know, with our teaching faculty and those folks, it's at least it's a set salary, right? And we kind of know, like, hey, if we take 9 months and divide it out, you know, we know what we have. But then there's also the other two groups, one being, you know, professionals that get a bonus. A lot of times people will get a bonus in February or March. It seems to be the pattern. And you know, it's always a question of then how do we allocate this over the year? There's a couple different ways I like to think about that. First, you know, if it was me and that budget was a probable but not a definite, I would try to make my monthly budget be based on my salary, right? Not necessarily needing that bonus to make my mortgage payments the rest of the year. And to make that work, sometimes what we've done with clients is said, okay, this is your budget, and this is how, you know, what you need to allocate out of your salary every month. And we also want these savings goals, but, you know, some of those can be allocated to the, you know, some of those extra things would then be budgeted for in the bonus.
Yeah, I think you're spot on. And I think the ideal thing is if you can do your monthly fixed expenses and have all the money that you need come out of your salary, and then when your bonus comes in, you say, okay, I'm going to put X amount towards this savings goal, X amount towards retirement, X amount towards
and catch up.
And catch up and put yourself in a better place. Or, you know, if you, let's say you're in a situation where maybe your bonus is a bigger part of your overall salary, and so you have to use some of that bonus. Well, let's try to base the amount that you need for your daily or monthly budget on like the baseline worst case scenario for what that bonus looks like.
Yeah. That's the way we've done it with clients, and it's not. Then it becomes about prioritization, right? And I guess the more important and the more regular and impactful the expense, the more important it is that comes out of your monthly salary.
Right. And also, the more important it is that you have a good emergency fund for when those, you know, for when those when those bonuses don't come through, you got a backup plan, right? You're not banking on this as your only option in case something does happen.
And if you're keeping score in the kitchen table podcast game, Nick made it 8 minutes and 30 seconds this episode before he mentioned emergency.
Right.
It's going to come up at some point during every episode. It's just a question of how far we make it.
That is true.
So yeah, the more uneven, and then the next group, this is where the emergency fund becomes even more important. What if you're a freelancer or a contractor who has not just lumpy income, like a contractor may make 80% of their money between May and October in Michigan, you know, or some condensed season, and you never know month to month when that check is going to come in. It gets even more difficult, but again, even more important to have that emergency fund and to have a budget.
Yeah, absolutely. And I can think of, you know, a great example would be somebody who does snow removal, right? You could start working in November, or you could not start working until February, and it's going to come in waves for sure. So, but yeah, just, you know, making sure that you're prepared for that, have the emergency fund, know what your budget numbers are, and make sure that you're setting aside enough to cover your expenses for the year before you start, you know, putting money in the vacation fund or spending money on things that don't qualify or that you don't need for your annual budget.
Yeah, functionally, the way I've done it with a couple clients is, try to come up with a baseline average, like worst case scenario, I should have X every month throughout the course of the year, and budget around that, and then build out from there with like, okay, if things go moderately well, then we're going to do this, and if things go even better than that, then we've got these other things we'll fund. But then those big months become equivalent to those bonuses that we talked about a second ago. That if July all of those payments come in, you need to be setting aside for the rest of the year and using that month to catch up on some of the lower priority stuff that maybe you've had to set aside in the leaner months.
Yeah, and another thing that I'll throw in here too as an option for people to consider is kind of know what the difference is between the necessities and maybe the things that aren't necessary, and know how to scale back. So it's not to say that you can't do those things, but if things start to turn in the wrong direction, you can always scale back on things. And so, and that comes into like your fixed expenses versus variable, not necessary expenses. And a great example would be if you're, if knowing what those are, you might be in a better position to know that maybe you can't afford a $800 a month truck payment, because that really pushes up the number of things that you have to pay on a regular basis. And so, knowing those numbers will really help you, and mapping it all out will really help you when you know what that fluctuation might be in case there is another recessionary downturn where your income's going to be affected for 6, 12, 18 months. Those are important things to know, how to make sure that you can kind of scale up or scale down depending on how the economy and the market's doing.
Right, especially if your income is going to be sensitive to such vagaries along with the weather.
Right.
And if there's one thing we know, it will change.
Always does.
It always does.
The only constant is change.
Yeah, so we did a pretty good deep dive into how to build a budget from scratch a few shows ago, and we'll link to that article and podcast in the notes that go with this one. So if you need the basics, go back and start with that one, and then this would kind of build on that with the idea of how to tweak it for those weird situations. Yeah,
for sure. And the successful people are the ones that have a budget that's written and they look at it on a regular basis, and they have an emergency fund. If you can do those two things, you're going to be able to weather all the storms.
Right. So I think that about covers it for today.
Wraps it up. Another one in the books.
And we will see what we can come up with for next week.
Sounds good, Dave. Always a pleasure.
All right. Thanks, Nick.